Now we'll talk about the modes of entry, and this simply means how does a company get its product into a market, right? How does it enter that market? What are the different ways or modes of entering that market? And so what I want to do here is talk about some of the pros and cons, the positives and negatives for different ways of entering a country's market. And so the first approach I want to talk about, we'll cover all of these, by the way, but the first one I want to discuss is exporting. And exporting clearly has some advantages, right? So exporting simply means you're taking a product, you're manufacturing it in one country, let's say the United States, and then you're trying to get that product, you're just going to ship it, transport it in some way, and enter another market that way. So you're going to export from the United States, let's say, to Mexico or to, let's say the European Union, something like that. Well, there's low minimal cost. You're already manufacturing the product. You don't have to set up a whole new operation in some other country. You're just exporting, right? You're just hiring somebody to ship the product out for you. And so that doesn't, that's a kind of a minimal risk kind of thing, right? Because you're not even committing yourself to another country. You're just trying to ship the product to another country. So there could be some benefits, and again, I talk about this experience curve economies I'm talking about this in the lecture videos on global strategy. But again, what that means simply is that, a company, let's say, that is producing a lot of a product in one manufacturing plant in one country, eventually over time is going to keep producing that again and again, is going to learn how to produce that more efficiently and reduce some of the costs involved with producing that product. That's the experience curve, right? And you're also going to have the economies of scale. You have a certain amount of fixed costs in a manufacturing plant. You've got to pay for the land, you've got to pay for the lights, you got to pay for the building, you got to pay for the workers. And so once you produce a certain amount of product, maybe you can earn back, everything, all that costs that you put in. But if you produce a lot of a product and go beyond just meeting your basic costs, then you can start to really make some profits. And so if you're exporting, you could do this even more easily, right? You could export a whole lot of a product to a particular country and really benefit from the economies of scale of producing this one product in one plant, and really get some of the benefits of this experience curve, as I've mentioned in the global strategy videos. So there's some real benefits to exporting, and clearly it is a low-risk approach. On the other hand, there are clearly some disadvantages, right? And so if you're manufacturing in a high-cost location like the United States, you could have put the manufacturing plant in Mexico or some lower-cost location. And so that would have been a benefit that you don't have if you're just exporting from one country to another. The other thing, so this low-cost manufacturing, you could have found a lower-cost location, is clearly one disadvantage of just exporting from just one country only. And then the other issue is you're going to have to pay the transportation costs, right? And the shipping costs for this product to export it to the other countries. If you had been manufacturing it locally in that other country, you wouldn't have to do that. And think about the tariff barriers. A lot of countries impose taxes on imports. And they do this partly as a way to make it more expensive for companies from outside of that country to export their products to them, right? And consumers then are going to have to pay this additional tax when they buy the product. The government of that local country would have imposed this tax on imports. That's a tariff. That they call that a tariff, right? A tariff barrier, because now it makes it more expensive for people in that country. They not only have to pay the cost of your product and the cost you had to pay to ship the product, but now they also have to pay this additional tax. And so that makes your product more expensive in that country, and it may make it more difficult for you to sell your product in that country. And then finally, again, when you ship a product to another country, you often have to rely on distributors to distribute that product for you. And sometimes those distributors, sometimes they're called foreign agents, may not always have your best interests at heart. They may be prioritizing some other company's product. And so it may not always be in your best interest to export. So clearly there's some advantages. I do want to add that it's a low risk approach. I'm trying to write those words low risk. It doesn't come across quite as I might like, but that's what I was trying to write. But there are also some disadvantages, okay? Now, turnkey projects is another completely different mode of entry that is very interesting. And this is where a company will just, maybe build something. This, I wrote here, involves a contractor who agrees to handle every detail of the project for a foreign client, including the training of the operating personnel. And so let me just give you an example. General Electric, some years back, this is way back, decades ago, got into the business of building nuclear power plants for other countries, right? And I know they did a lot of these for Brazil. And so one of the things they were doing is they were actually building the nuclear power plants. They were training the local people how to operate the nuclear power plants. And then once they had done that, they said, well, now you can pay us for that. And, we'll wash our hands of it. We've minimized our risk. We're done, right? And so this, I think, is this is a clear classic example of a turnkey project. We build the project, we train you how to operate it, then we hand over the keys. We turn the keys over to you, and now we're done with it, and we've minimized our risk, and we get paid. So at the completion of the contract, the foreign client is handed the key is turned over, and the project is ready to operate. Now, there's some clear benefits to this. The advantages is the firm that has this know-how, that knows how to build nuclear power plants, can earn money just from that know-how, because it can assemble and turn out this project very nicely. It knows how to do this. It can train the people how to run the project, but then it can wash its hands of that, and it's much less risky. Clearly, it's a low-risk sort of strategy for companies that are doing this, because if they were to run the nuclear power plant, there could be all kinds of potential dangers of accidents. There could be political risk in the country. They could just get paid right up front, wash their hands of it, and they're done. Now, the disadvantage is that if you're transferring all of that know-how to local people, you could end up creating a competitor. You're giving away a lot of your proprietary know-how, that knowledge of how to do this. You're giving it to other people in that country. So they actually could develop this technology themselves. They could kind of learn from you how to do this, and they could say, we don't need you anymore. We're going to start doing this, and now we can do this even better than you. So that's one of the key disadvantages of these kinds of turnkey projects. By the way, it should have said turnkey there. I hope it says turnkey on the actual slide, not exporting. Now, let's talk about another mode of entry, and that's licensing. Now, this is a very sort of minimal risk strategy as well. And so this is where somebody, let's say, comes up with some new innovative product, some new amazing invention, let's say, and then grants the intellectual property rights, right? How to build this, how to manufacture, how to get everything about this, the secrets of making this, to someone else. License it. That's the licensor, the person that has come up with this new patented product or copyrighted service or something like that now has licensed this. And basically that is the right to someone else to make this product and to sell it. And then the inventor, the licensor, the person that gave that license, has the right to royalty fees. So that person is, doesn't have to, go through all the hassle of actually setting up a manufacturing plant, building the manufacturing plant, constructing the product, hiring other people to make this thing. This person can just say, I've come up with this new innovative idea. I'm going to let someone else actually go through all the hassle of making it, marketing it, selling it, and I'll just sit back and collect a small percentage of all of their sales. I'll get a royalty fee. And so I don't know if any of you have seen this very interesting, great TV show, Shark Tank. But there is one of the sharks that often appears on that Shark Tank. I think he calls himself Mr. Wonderful. And he actually is kind of a tough, negotiator, not necessarily the most wonderful guy, because he makes shrewd deals. And he says, well, listen, why don't you just license the product to me? And I'll just give you a small fee, right? A little 1% on anything I sell, And so the downside, I guess, there's the downside to this. So let's look at the advantages and the disadvantages of licensing. So the advantages is, the firm or the individual that does this doesn't have to pay the development costs and the risks associated with opening a manufacturing plant and opening up a new market and entering a new market and going through all of the hassles of doing that. You don't have to worry about all the barriers to investment and dealing with local regulations. You just come up with this new patented product and you just license it to someone else, let them take care of all that. And so if a firm has come up with some new, interesting, innovative idea, intangible property, intellectual property, that might have some business applications, but they don't want to go through all of the costs of developing this and manufacturing this and marketing it, oh my gosh, entering new markets, they can just license it to another company. So, I mean, that's really a low-risk kind of strategy, very minimal costs, low costs, some real advantages to this. But the disadvantages, I think, might come with what I was telling you about with that Shark Tank. Mr. Wonderful, right, says, oh, why don't you license it to me, right? Because then you can lose control over this. And there is the potential for the loss of proprietary know-how, so that's always a danger, and this is something that we see that can happen in some countries in particular, but also by losing control, by losing tight control over the manufacturing, the marketing, and the strategy, you can't really reap the most, lion's share of the profits that could be made from this, right? Because you aren't the one that is, really getting most of the money from this now. You're getting a small licensing fee. Okay, you didn't have to pay any of the costs. You didn't have to take any of the risks. But, and you're just sitting back and collecting your royalty fee. But that could be very minimal compared to what you could have been making, right? And so sometimes this strategy then, this licensing strategy, could make sense for some lone isolated inventor or some small company that doesn't have the money to kind of really engage in this, developing the manufacturing and marketing and strategy for really selling this product in foreign markets. But it could be then you're turning over the lion's share of the profits to someone else, right? So there are also some benefits, right, to actually controlling the marketing and the strategy and the manufacturing, because then there are certain things you can do to really enhance your profits. We'll talk about that in the global strategy section. And again, so if you're just a licensor, and you're letting someone else do all this other stuff for you, you may not be reaping the biggest profits from that. But again, sort of the pros and cons. It depends on what situation you're in. So to reduce the risk, firms can use cross-licensing agreements or link the agreement with a decision to form a joint venture. So this is something that, this gets into some pretty sophisticated kind of strategies where, okay, we're going to license that product to you, but if you were to steal it, well, you have licensed some things that you like, that you have developed to us. And so then we'll steal that, right? So, I mean, there's this kind of, potential ways you can kind of keep the leverage over them to make sure that the other company isn't breaking any rules or doing things that could be harmful to you. So these are just some of the pros and cons of licensing, okay? Now, another kind of related mode of entry, a way of entering a market, is franchising. And so this is a form of licensing. Do you see? It's just a kind of licensing. And so this is when, let's say, for example, we have all heard of the famous examples of McDonald's, right? So this is when somebody comes up with an idea, let's say, how to make a hamburger very fast and very low cost, still quite tasty, right? A secret sauce, all these wonderful things. And so someone could come up with this amazing idea, and then they say, well, we don't want to build all the little stores. What we could do is we could sell this franchise to others. And so they have to follow the exact same sort of procedures that we follow. They have to make sure that the quality is there. We're going to kind of monitor that, but we're going to have others actually run other stores. They can buy the franchise. And so that in return for that, they get the right to kind of, the secrets, how to do this and how to manufacture this and what kind of suppliers we use and all those wonderful things. But so it avoids the cost and risk of opening up in foreign markets. You could franchise and let other people do that. And then you, as the owner of the franchisor, you can just sit back and collect the royalty fees, right? The disadvantage is that, again, you can't take an advantage of all the potential benefits. If you were controlling, where these stores were going, you could then control some of the costs. You could decide how to, distribute the profits. And there's a big disadvantage is that sometimes it's hard to ensure that the franchisees, those that are, actually running the little stores that have bought a franchise from you and they're paying you royalty payments, that's great. But what if they don't keep the quality up? What if they don't actually do things in the proper way? It could hurt your image. It could hurt your brand. And so that's really a potential disadvantage to this franchising, you see. So McDonald's avoids this problem by ensuring they monitor very closely how the franchisees are doing, how they do things. They make sure they get trained at, McDonald's University, how to make the hamburgers, those kinds of things. And so that's one of the big challenges with franchising. So again, some pros and cons with that mode of entry. Now we get into sort of where it really starts to get interesting, and this is the joint ventures. And I really want to contrast that. We're going to talk next about the wholly owned subsidiaries, but these are two very important modes of entry that I think are really worth discussing here. And with the joint venture, there are some really advantages to this. So this is when a company makes an agreement with another company, and they have both agreed that they will both own this joint undertaking, this business in a particular country. So this is an establishment of a firm that is jointly owned by two or more otherwise independent firms. And so we can think of Walmart establishing a joint venture when it first entered the Mexican market with a local Mexican firm called Cifra. C-I-F-R-A, if you ever want to read about that interesting case. That was an interesting case in itself. So I think sometimes there are some real advantages to this. Now think about this. So a firm can benefit from a local partner's knowledge of the host country's business environment. Now, in the case of Walmart, when it first entered the Mexican market, this is way back in the mid-1990s, early 1990s, Walmart had never entered at that point a foreign market. At that point, they had never tried to put up a Walmart in another country. So Walmart actually did not know anything about Mexico. They didn't know very much about foreign markets at that time. They didn't have apparently many Thunderbird people working at Walmart at that point. And so what Walmart did is they went into Mexico. Now, there were regulations in Mexico at that time that forced them to have a local partner, that Walmart could not own more than 50% of any undertaking in Mexico. That was a rule at that time. That has since changed in Mexico, but at that time, that's how it was. And so Walmart was forced to have this local partner, Cifra. And as a result, Cifra, who had been operating in Mexico for many years, it was a Mexican retail firm, they said, we know how to do business here. We can teach you everything we need to know. And so this Walmart-Cifra joint venture, and I'm trying to write the word Walmart here, and the joint venture was with a Mexican firm, CIFRA. I thought that was a very interesting joint venture when they entered, taught Walmart everything they need to know about the Mexican retail industry, about Mexican consumers. Cifra already knew, like in this neighborhood in Mexico City, you have to have this kind of store, but in a completely different neighborhood with different socioeconomic levels, you had to have a different kind of store with a different format. And as a result, Walmart became very successful in Mexico. But, there are some disadvantages. Now, the additional benefits, you share the costs and risks with the local partner, and you can avoid the risk, perhaps, of nationalization or other adverse actions by a government of that country. So sometimes governments will see a very successful business and they'll say, gee, we're going to just seize the assets of that business and turn it into a government-owned company. Or we're going to impose some new regulations or requirements on that business. But if you have a local partner and you're working together in a joint venture, governments in that country might be less inclined to do something hostile to that venture because then they would be attacking their own company as well, right? So I think this is why joint ventures really can have some advantages. On the other hand, there can be some real disadvantages to joint ventures. And so among these are, again, the local partner may gain control of the technology. Now, we saw in a case we read about the U.S. wind turbine companies that were then going over into China and forming joint ventures with Chinese firms. eventually what happened is the Chinese firms gained a lot of their proprietary knowledge on how to make these wind turbines, and they gained control of the technology, and they really didn't need the foreign firms anymore. In fact, they started gaining market share more and more. And so that's one real danger of this kind of joint venture. You may lose control over the subsidiaries, local plants in that country. You could have conflicts. In fact, most joint ventures actually fail because there are cultural clashes or conflicts between the two companies about how to do things, or how even the company culture, there could be a clash. And so often we find that actually the vast majority of joint ventures end up failing. So there are some real benefits to joint ventures, but I think especially for high-tech companies, companies that have a lot of proprietary know-how, they don't like to use joint ventures because they fear that they could lose control over their technology. So that's a clear potential disadvantage. Especially, I think, for these high-tech companies, and one example might be Intel Corporation, which makes microprocessors. What we find is that a lot of these kinds of companies really prefer to have a wholly owned subsidiary. And that means where they have no local partner whatsoever, that they have 100% ownership of the local manufacturing plant, the local operation in that country. We call that the local subsidiary, just like a branch office of that company that is manufacturing or running the operation in that country. That's the subsidiary. So the big advantages, right? And by the way, companies that are doing this can just go in and establish a completely new operation in that country, or they could acquire an existing firm. So there's two different ways of establishing a wholly owned subsidiary, but the bottom line is this means the foreign company that is entering under this kind of mode of entry is establishing itself as 100% ownership of that new operation, that new subsidiary. So this clearly, the advantage is the reduced risk of losing control over the core competencies, and that could be proprietary knowledge, right? And again, I refer to this example of Intel. This is why they do not want to have joint ventures. They have wholly owned subsidiaries. This allows for the tight control of their operations in different countries. And so that could mean that it's up to you. You can decide, okay, are we going to expand this company? Are we going to expand manufacturing in this country or that country? It's completely up to the country. There aren't any local partners to worry about. It could be a real benefit to trying to realize location and experience curve economies, right? A big foreign company could say, well, we're going to put a manufacturing plant in this low-cost country, that other low-cost country. And again, they don't have to consult with a local partner about that. They just choose what is in the best interest of that company. But again, this is, usually this is big companies find it easier to do this because they bear the full costs and risks of setting up the overseas operations. But in some cases, in many cases for high-tech companies, that's worth that because they don't want to risk the potential loss of their technology. So again, these are the various kinds of modes of entry. And then the question is, how do you select the mode of entry? And I think it just depends on what are the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages of each various approach. And what I urge you to do is, for those doing the group project, of course, consider whether your company entered with the right mode of entry in the country that you're assessing. Did this make sense? Should they have done a different mode of entry? Should they have gone in as a joint venture or a wholly owned subsidiary rather than the way they went in? So these are things to consider. And often we do find, as I've been saying, when the competitive advantage, when the thing that makes that company uniquely successful, its competitive advantage, what sets it apart from all the other companies, when that is based on proprietary technological know-how, right? How to, develop certain kinds of microprocessors. I'm thinking of Intel again now. Well, then firms should avoid licensing or joint venture arrangements because that could potentially lead to the loss of their technology. If it's primarily based on management know-how, like McDonald's, how to run a, it's kind of a burger joint, that kind of thing, well, then the risk of loss of your technology and know-how is lower. So franchises or joint ventures might make more sense in those kinds of circumstances. So again, it sort of depends on the nature of your company and the nature of your investment, what mode of entry makes the most sense. And whether the company should just go in as a greenfield, build in, if it's a wholly owned subsidiary, we're going to go in and build this new manufacturing plant on our own. We're not going to acquire an existing firm, or if it should acquire an existing established firm. Well, again, that depends, right? And so there are some benefits to just acquiring an existing firm. And I'm thinking of another case, an example of Walmart. When they went to the country of Chile, they said, we're just going to take over completely running existing retail operation, Lidar in Chile, that company in Chile. They just acquired it outright, took 100% ownership. So that can be less risky. I mean, you have some people there that already know how to run it. You're just going to bring some of your advantages to them. However, sometimes, you can overpay for this. There can be disadvantages under these circumstances. There can be a clash of cultures when you take over an existing firm, and that can make integration of the different kinds of personnel more difficult. Sometimes you don't, adequately screen. Are there real problems there that we aren't seeing? So there are some pros and cons to just greenfield ventures, starting fresh, starting from scratch, versus acquisitions. But again, these are part of the decisions that every company needs to make. The greenfield adventures, this means a company just going in and building from the ground up, starting its new operation on its own. That means it can build the kind of subsidiary that it wants. On the other hand, it takes longer, it's riskier, and there can be some problems, right? So a competitor might come in and just acquire another company and quickly move in and build market share, and then you still building your new manufacturing plant or something like that. So there are these pros and cons. So these are all the different ways of entering. These are the pros and cons of greenfield ventures versus acquisitions. And these are some of the basic decisions that every company needs to make as it decides to enter a new market.